Birthplace today? Have
Yeah.
you all been to the birthplace? Yeah. Birthplace. That's normal. That's normal. And of course, the big difference between the birthplace and here, apart from the fact that the guides on duty don't wear silly costumes here like they do in the birthplace, is that here there is no house left to see. You probably or may have picked up when you're in the birthplace that the great house that William Shakespeare lived in with his wife and kids once he'd become successful was actually destroyed. It was destroyed more than 200 years ago. So what I'll do is I'll start with why the house no longer exists. In other words, what happened to it when it was destroyed. Then I'll jump back in time to when the house was new, and then we'll build up to the Shakespeare connection. So, where you're standing is on the site of what was the biggest house in Stratford. Some people say it was the second biggest house. I think it was true to say it was the biggest family-owned house in Stratford. It was the biggest house when it was built. It was the biggest house when Shakespeare and his family lived here, when the house was 100 years old, and it was still the biggest home when the house was destroyed. So in 1753, there were new owners. So we were 140 years nearly after Shakespeare had died. The new owners of the house were very rich, and they were very rich because the man, who was a reverend in the Church of England called Francis Gastrell, he was a lucky man because he married an heiress. He married a very rich woman, and between them they owned nearly 20 other houses, but this was the only one in the town of Stratford they owned. The other houses were scattered around the Midlands, we think, because he was active in the church north of Birmingham, not in Stratford. And they used this house as a kind of holiday home. They only spent a few weeks every summer here. And they moved here in 1753, and they'd been here for a couple of summers only when they angered local people so much that some of them came to the house to protest. Now, what had they done to cause such anger with local people? They had chopped down in the grounds an old mulberry tree that Shakespeare is supposed to have planted 150 or so years before. This was one living connection between Shakespeare and that time, and it angered local people so much that some, when they protested, threw stones at the house and broke windows. So this family never really got off to a good start with the local community. And as the years progressed, over the next 4 or 5 years, a number of other things happened that irritated them. For example, they tried to buy some adjoining land to increase the size of the estate, and obstacles were put in the way so they couldn't do what they wanted to do. That irritated them. There was also at that time a growing interest in Shakespeare's story. In the 100 or so years after Shakespeare died, his reputation kind of went a bit quiet. There were new forms of drama coming about at the end of the 1600s that people were more interested in. But by the mid-1700s, Shakespeare's reputation was growing again. There was a greater interest, and more people were coming to the town of Stratford to find out about Shakespeare. And so this family were constantly being interrupted by people knocking on the door, wanting to have a tour of this great house. Welcome, do come and join us. We're just starting with why there's no house left to see, so you haven't missed very much. So this family didn't like the constant intrusions of this beginnings of a tourist industry in Stratford. But the thing that finally drove them out of Stratford, and the thing that made them destroy this great house, was that in 1759, the local town council imposed a tax. This tax was used to help the poor of the town. It was only imposed on rare occasions. In medieval times, possibly it was used to help the poor if there'd been a bad harvest. Now, this family resented this tax being imposed. It was only imposed on people who owned large houses. And they did not like the fact that they were being asked to pay this tax. Despite the fact they were very rich, despite the fact they were in the Church of England, they did not like to be asked to pay this money, because they argued that they only lived here for a few weeks of every year, so they shouldn't have to pay the tax, or if they did pay tax, it should be a reduced amount. So the arguments went backwards and forwards until the town authorities lost patience, threatened them with court action, and rather than have the shame of being taken up to the court and made to pay this tax, they decided to leave Stratford. Essentially, they did a runner. They organised a gang of men to come onto this site and completely demolish this great house. Nothing was left. There was just building rubble here, most of which was carted away for other building projects in the town. Some wood panelling in the building you can still see in the hotel over there, although that's having a huge refit, as you can see. An old brick staircase is still available in the house just by Hawes Croft. But essentially this site became empty and it was never built on again. No other house was built on this site again. And I'll come back to that if we have time a bit later on. But what I want to do now is jump back in time to when there was a house here, and this is when the house was brand spanking new. In the late Middle Ages, 1483, this site was available to be built on. The important thing about the site was it had its own water source, the well. The well exactly where it was in the days of Shakespeare and when the house was new. In fact, there were 3 or 4 smaller wells on the site as well. If you go into the house, you'll see in the passageway, the brick-lined passageway, a bit of circular brickwork. There was a well there as well. So anyway, this house was built in 1483 for a very rich local cloth merchant. You may know that this area all around Stratford is covered with sheep, and sheep in the Middle Ages was an incredibly valuable commodity. Sheep wool was like oil is to Saudi Arabia today. It was really a very valuable commodity. People's clothes were made out of wool. Great tapestries were made out of wool. The man who had this house built was a cloth merchant, very important man in Stratford because he had built the first permanent stone bridge over the river. He had built huge improvements to the chapel behind us here. This man, Hugh Clopton, was a very significant figure later in his life because he became the Lord Mayor of London. So, a very significant man, but he wanted a grand house built. Now, there were no drawings or pictures made of it at the time. This is only an artist's impression, but we're quite confident it's accurate for 3 reasons really. First, it's in the style of a grand medieval manor house. Open courtyard in the middle, immediately behind where I am, a great building at the front, but also a huge main building which was family accommodation just there. The second reason we're confident is because of written descriptions of the time. It was described as a pretty house made of brick and timber at a time when brick was not a local building material. No other houses in Stratford were built of brick in the Middle Ages. You had to be very, very rich to bring in a lot of brick into this town. But the third reason we're confident is because of very recent archaeology. Now, until 2010, where we're standing now was just a garden. After the destruction of the house, about 100 years later, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust was formed. They acquired this site eventually, and it became a very beautiful garden. Nothing particularly Shakespearean about it, but it had a nice feel about it. In fact, many people thought that the house there was Shakespeare's house. Going back to what you were saying earlier, that many people thought that was Shakespeare's house and this was its garden. But the archaeology that we had commissioned, starting very recently in 2010, so just 8 years ago, dug up this whole site. All of this paved area that you see was dug down, maybe 3.5 meters or so in some cases below where we are now. And yes, they discovered the outline, the foundations of the building that we already knew about. We did know there was a big building at the front, but it revealed things about the rest of the site that we just did not know before. So for example, where you're stood now, by this red blob, is where the servants did their work. And we know that because in identifying different sections of the line of buildings here, they discovered evidence of different sorts of activities. So there was a cellar immediately below where you are there for storage, probably a little parlour above. There was a side entrance just there. You're standing just by where they made beer in large quantities, in the kitchen in the brew house, because they discovered a whole range of things, scattered malt and other things that were used in the beer making process. Big kitchen, water from the well, went straight there to make beer, because beer was safe to drink. The water, because when they found the foundations of that hall, they discovered the base of a very large fireplace. And that drove the archaeologists and the academics and scholars to realise that you would need a large fireplace to heat a high-ceilinged main room, probably a double-storied main hall-type room, a grand hall that you could impress visitors with. And so we believe that the central feature of this great hall there was this double-storied room. Bedrooms were off to the side, almost certainly. So we now believe that the Shakespeare family lived their lives there. Until 2010, we thought they lived their lives there. So this is a very big change that's really very recent. So the question is really, how come Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, could afford to buy such a grand house in his hometown at the relatively early age of 33, given that he was from very humble beginnings? So you've all been to the birthplace. You know how close it is to here. Just imagine William Shakespeare when he was a little boy. We're pretty certain he went to school every day for nearly 7 years. Very unusual for a boy of that age at the time. Very few kids went to school at all. But because of his family connections, his father, as you probably know, became the mayor of Stratford, he was eligible to go to the local grammar school, just behind that chapel there. So just imagine little William Shakespeare every day for nearly 7 years, 6 days a week, going to school, walking the route that many of you have taken today, because the school's just behind this chapel here. In fact, you can still go in and see the old schoolrooms almost like they were in the days of Shakespeare. He went past this house 4 times a day because he went home for lunch. So do the maths, and he passed this house many, many times. He would know this house really very well. He, as he got a bit older, close to his teenage years, may have had friends who worked here, because some of the younger people who worked here were probably a similar age to him, and they may have been his friends. So again, use your imagination. He may have met up with them and they've gone off fishing down the river, chasing rabbits in the fields, chasing girls in the town. Who knows what they did? You've got to use your imagination while you're here. Anyway, so he would know this house really very well. 10 years later, he's a young man. He's a young man with responsibilities, because he's got Anne Hathaway pregnant, as you probably know. She's nearly 8 years older than him. Soon after the first child is born, she's pregnant again with twins. So by the mid-1580s, we lose sight of William Shakespeare. We've no idea where he goes or what he does. There are a whole range of theories, but nothing definite is known. But all we do know is that the early 1590s, William Shakespeare pops up in London with success of his early plays. Now, to help us on the site here, we've got all of these wind vanes or play pennants. They've each got the title of one of Shakespeare's plays in the order we believe they were first written. Early plays down there when you came in, last plays in the hall. And if you'll see Midsummer Night's Dream here, 1595. The next one there's Romeo and Juliet, also 1595. The plays that side of where I am are the plays that gave Shakespeare enough money, enough of a reputation, patronage from rich earls. However he did it, by 1597, which is Merchant of Venice, 1597 is when he buys this great house. And the house cost £120, which was about 6 times what the average school teacher earned in the 1590s. And he is able eventually to move here with his wife and his 2 daughters. His only son had died 1 year before. You may know Hamlet was his name. He died in 1596. But William Shakespeare moves here with his wife and daughters in 1597 on the back of the success of those early plays. But it therefore follows that the plays he wrote after Merchant of Venice, and they arguably are his finest plays, plays like Hamlet and Macbeth and Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, Antony and Cleopatra, King Lear. Anybody see King Lear on television last night? Yeah, okay. Anthony Hopkins as King Lear. It was marvellous. Anyway, so all of these plays, if you just do a quick count, you'll see that after he buys New Place, he's still got nearly 2/3 of his plays ahead of him, still to write. And the big change in our thinking, now we know exactly what this house was like, is that we believe that he wrote most of those later plays here in New Place, not in London. Of course, the plays on the whole were presented first in London, performed in London, fine-tuned in London. But we believe that he came to Stratford where there was more peace and quiet, he could relax a bit more, and he wrote most of those later plays here in Stratford. Now, Anne Hathaway was, as you probably know, from a farming family. Behind where the house was are large grounds. So William Shakespeare made some improvements to the house in the first year that he was here. He added this feature onto the roof, and we do know that because there was one drawing ever made of the house as it was in the 1600s. Actually, it's on a video loop in the museum behind me. So we do know this feature was added. But behind the house, there were very large grounds. We think it went all the way back to the river where the theatre is. You can just see the theatre roof down that way. These grounds in the days of William Shakespeare was like a small working farm, and we think that Anne, because she was from a farming family, was in charge of managing it. There were animals there to look after, there were vegetable plots, herb gardens, kitchen gardens, orchards, fruit bushes, 2 barns, a very big site to manage. So that's what Anne was busy doing while William was going on a regular basis to London. Now, behind the where the house was, we now have very beautiful gardens. The first part of it is where there used to be stables. Horses came in on the side and there was stabling for horses there. Beyond that area, which we call a knot garden in the plan that you've got, you'll see the Great Garden. In the Great Garden, you've got sculptures of various Shakespeare characters, 9 different Shakespeare plays. Very beautiful sculptures made mostly in the late 1990s. But what we've got here on this site now are very recent sculptures, because when the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust finished the archaeology, they had to decide what to do here. Should they reintroduce just a garden like they had been here for 100 years? Or should they, now they knew exactly what this house was like for the first time, should they do something a bit more creative here? And they decided to raise money through the lottery and other means to commission a range of sculptors to create these external sculptures, which is why we've got all these plays that I've already mentioned as a sculpture. In the ground, you'll see all the titles, all the first 2 lines of all of Shakespeare's sonnets as you skirt around in these little metal implants. We've got the globe of the world as the world was known in Elizabethan times. So you'll see the continents have very jagged edges. Anybody from Australia here? No. Oh, that's a shame, Because Australia is a real mess, because obviously in Elizabethan times nobody knew about Australia. A strong box in the corner represents the wealth that Shakespeare had accrued. The ship represents that this was an age of discovery, but also Shakespeare wrote about the sea in many of his plays. And obviously The Tempest, his last great play, we believe was written here. And then the sculptures over there, I will leave one of our other guys to talk about, because you need to touch them and feel them before you do that. And finally, of course, we believe that William Shakespeare died here in this house. We're pretty certain he died in Stratford. We've no knowledge of the exact circumstances of Shakespeare's death, except to say we'd like to think he died peacefully here. The last picture I'll show you, actually, for those people who've arrived a bit late, and those people who know the story of why the house no longer exists, this actually is what the house looked like when it was destroyed. Quite a bit different from what it was like 100 or so years before. This is what the front of the house was like in any case, because in 1702 the new owners completely knocked down the gatehouse, and they probably knocked down part of where we're standing now, and they built an almost square building in contemporary style. So this is what the house looked like when it was finally destroyed in 1759. So it had changed quite a lot. We've no idea what they did to the hall in 1702. They may have left it standing as accommodation. We just don't know. But in any case, however you look at it, there's nothing left because it was all knocked down. If anyone's got any other questions, feel free to hang about and have a chat. Otherwise, enjoy your afternoon. Museum in there to have a look at. I think the rain may hold off. So have a good time.
Thank you.
Hello, any other questions? Okay, what's the question? Okay, the place was knocked down because the man who owned the house, he was a very rich man, and he was a vicar of the church. He was told he had to pay tax on this house, and because he only lived here for a few weeks of every year, he had many other houses. He objected to paying this tax. The town council told him not to pay. Rather than be called up before the court and made to pay, he decided to walk away from Stratford to one of his 20 other houses and decided to completely demolish the house, because it was the size of the house that incurred the tax. It was only people who had large houses who were told to pay this tax. Kind of what?